All right, let's go ahead and get started. Definitely see people trickling in. Welcome everyone. So we have another Dewey seminar series today. Really excited about this one. And I'll quickly get to introducing our guests. But before we go into that, I just want to cover a couple housekeeping items. First, these work way better if you ask questions. So please be engaged. We see the questions come through. There's a Q&A feature built into Zoom, and it's really, we're going to be monitoring that live as they come through. And so we'd like to get those questions answered. Hopefully while we're on the slides or while we're on the topic. So let's definitely make this a discussion. So please don't hesitate to ask. Any questions we maybe don't get to, we can either handle at the end or we'll be sure to follow up. Matt and I will respond to anything that we can't get to live. We definitely want questions answered. So feel free to use the Q&A function. This will be recorded. A couple people have asked that, hey, they can't attend, or maybe they can only attend the first half. We're definitely recording this and we'll send it out to everyone who's registered and make that available. So thank you guys for registering today. And then finally, just to quickly kind of pitch some of our upcoming webinars, we have two more scheduled so far. We have one on March 6th with WageScape. So that'll be salary and compensation data that WageScape provides on the platform. We're going to dive in with their product manager and CEO then. And then the CEO of lobbyingdata.com will be joining us on April 4th. So be sure to look out for the registration links in the follow-up of this. With that, I will introduce Matt. So Matt Taaffe is the VP of product from Taaffe. Like I said, I'm very excited to dive into Taaffe. I've been able to poke around with their data. I think it's very impressive the way they've kind of brought this data set together and built it. There's a lot of unique kind of attributes and ways they think about mobility and patterns data. And this is something that's been very popular from researchers. And I've seen firsthand the popularity of these types of data sets. And Taaffe has a couple of unique ways in which they create this data set, the sourcing of it, and some of the attributes that are available with it. And so personally, I'm really excited to dive in and kind of learn about those differences. So I actually myself will have a few questions for you, Matt, because I'm excited to learn. But with that, I'll
Good to hear.
introduce it to you. Yeah, and go ahead and take it away.
Thanks very much. Cheers, Evan. Really glad to have the opportunity to kind of walk through the data set here. Quite a lot to kind of cover, so hopefully it's not too much to throw at you guys. But yeah, if you've got any questions as we go along, please feel free to ask them. So quick introduction to myself while we're here. So my name is Matt Taaffe. I've been in the geospatial sort of industry for 7 years. For the last 5 years of those, I've been working in product. I first started in marketing and made the transition across. And now, yeah, I'm the VP product at PassBy. So what is PassBy? So we're a geospatial intelligence company. We take a broad range of unique data sets, and then we use these as inputs into a range of different models, as I'll sort of go through today, that basically outputs AI-driven insights on the retail industry. So we've got insights that look at the number of visits to stores, the visitors to those stores, and everything kind of in between. This is the sort of basis. Now, one thing I kind of want to point out at this stage, there's a lot of companies in the geospatial space that are looking really at the individual. They're looking at an individual, be that as a device, as an ad ID, but that's what they that's their sort of trade. That's not what we're about. We're not about the individual and insights there. We're about the insights to the store. So the key industries that we work with are retail, real estate, and finance. And we're trying to understand the performance of individual stores and how we can segment them based on the visitors. So that's just one clarification I wanted to make at this stage. The data sets that we currently have available on Dewey are store visits. Now, this is a individual sort of counts to stores on an hourly, daily, and weekly level, and store visitors. And this is an analysis of those visitors on a sort of demographic level, psychographic level, as well as a few sort of insights around cross-shopping as well. So today's seminar, and I've got about 25 slides here, just so you're aware of where we are in the presentation, is going to be broken down into 3 sections. I'm starting off with the sources. I'm starting off with the signals that we input into our models. The next stage, I'll kind of touch on a very sort of hopefully broad level, the models that we use to actually create this data. And then finally, I'll go back to the data sets themselves. talk about how they're called, sort of, formatted, and talk a little bit about how other people are using them in a way to kind of inspire you guys. So, data sources then. We use a veritable panoply of different data sources in our models. This is just a handful of them that I threw on a slide. What I'm going to kind of focus on today is just the four that's highlighted here: location, POI, that's point of interest, sensors, and consumer data, because I think that between these four, I can explain most of what we're doing. So first things first, location data. When I talk about location data, I'm talking about GPS signals from mobile devices. Now, we access this data, we purchase this data from multiple providers. This originates from data from mobile apps, so it all comes down to that mobile device level, but we reach it a lot further down the stage than that. Because we've got multiple providers, we've got a huge sample. We're looking at over 175 million daily active users. Now, nominally, that is something like 50% of the population, but realistically, knowing that people have multiple devices, and to be frank with you, knowing that there's there's always going to be a proportion of that that's, low quality, fraudulent data. It's going to be less than that. Regardless, we still have the biggest sample panel available on the market. That boils down to 2.6 billion signals. And when I talk about a signal, I'm talking about a mobile device being at a point in space, so a geographical coordinate at a point in time. So some sort of persistent ID, a lat long, and a timestamp. That is what the signals are. And we've got terabytes of those that we're analyzing every day. The next source that I want to talk about is POI data. Now, we get this data from Safegraph, which is also available on the Dewey data platform. I watched the seminar that they've done previously as well. When we look at point of interest data, for those that don't know, this can be anything from a clothing store to a quick serve restaurant, from a grocery store to a gym. We're focusing our attention to, one, the US. We're only focused on the US market at the moment. And two, only branded points of interest. So only points of interest that belong to a wider retail chain, or a wider chain that's consumer facing. That still amounts to, actually, I mean, on last count, it was over 7,000 retail or consumer facing chains. So that needs to be updated, actually. So yeah, those are the kind of two ways of kind of this helps us contextualize the locations that the location data signals are at. The next source that I want to talk about is sensor data. Now, we have access to a data source that is basically data from hardware in stores. This is literal in-store sensors tracking the foot traffic of people that are going in and going out of the store. We have access to around 50,000 sensors, so that's 50,000 individual stores that we're looking at, and that is around sort of 300 plus retailers. Now, I say we have access to this data. I want to be really clear here. We don't hold this data in the same way that we do the location data. We access this remotely via what we call a black box setup. So we don't see, everything about this individual data, but we get this aggregated and anonymized enough to pull out those patterns. The final data source that I want to flag here is consumer data. Now, we've partnered with TransUnion, who've basically taken the United States, divided it up into ZIP+4s, and for each individual ZIP+4, they've provided a profile of the people that live there. As part of this profile, there, each individual ZIP+4 has a range of 56 psychographic profiles that they're linked to. I'll go into this in a bit more detail later. And they also surface, over 20 demographic traits, of which we actively use around half a dozen at the moment. These are kind of the key data sources that I'm going to sort of, mention as we're sort of going through the rest of the conversation. So now I want to take our attention to the next section, models. Now, this isn't going to make much sense at this stage, but hopefully as I go through the process, it starts making a little bit more sense. A quick overview here. I basically grouped the kind of models and the process that we've got based on the data sets that they provide. This section here is all about taking this location data, the billions of noisy, really difficult data to deal with, and making sense of it. So that's what this is doing. The output here, the observed visits here, is a reliable and representative view of the activity of our sample pattern. That's what these set of processes are doing here. This gets fed into a range of models that are all about taking that data and scaling it and sort of extrapolating that to get it to the store visits data that we have available on Dewey data today. A kind of separate but interlinked process down here is all about how we get the information on store visitors. And with this is attributing our sample panel of devices with that demographic, with that psychographic data from TransUnion, and then using them to kind of draw information about the visitors to individual stores. That's kind of the three things that I'm going to be focusing on in this next section. So starting with observed visits. So we've got, as I said, over 2 billion data signals that are coming into our system every day. We've got to make sense of this. The first thing that we need to do is identify what is a visit, what is data that indicates somebody has visited a location, and what is a journey? What is somebody passing by? What is somebody driving past in their car? The way that we do this is that we cluster the signals based on the devices, based on space, and based on time. So if there's a group of signals from the same device in the same general location at the same sort of time, then we will cluster that together, and this becomes what we call a device visit. This is a device visiting somewhere. The next stage is we've got to attribute that device visit, which is just a device visiting somewhere at a point in time, to a specific point of interest. And that is the attribution process that we do here. So thanks to the data that Safecraft provide, they obviously provide information about the individual stores, so the name, the category, the address. But what they also do, which is really, really a game changer for us, is they provide the polygon of the outline of the building. This means that we can attribute these visits in a much, much more accurate way than if you were to take a location and add a radius around it and connect it up that way, or take the coordinates of the store and then try and do something with the distance. By basically going, this is the device visit, it is enveloped in this polygon, we can be really accurate about the visit attribution. So that's kind of the first part of this process. The next stage is actually, kind of quality control. One of the things that we often have to deal with is overlapping points of interest. So take a multi-level mall. In that event, there's going to be polygons on top of polygons. How do we accurately sort of attribute the device visit to the right store? Now, what we do here is we take information about the device, we take information about the time of the visit, we take information about the point of interest itself in order to appropriately sort of score the visit depending on the locations there. So to give you an example, if we saw a young professional visiting a location at 8 o'clock in the morning, the algorithm is more likely to is going to score the Starbucks higher than the Old Navy above, because of the time of day, because of the general sort of patterns we see with the demographic types, and based on the point of interest itself. The other thing that we have to do as part of this process is weight the visits based on the quality of the data. So I've mentioned, or I've alluded to before, about the sort of quality of some of this data set. If we see a lot of noisy data, if we see a lot of events that we deem as lower quality in the same sort of area, then we're going to weight that visit lower than we are a much sort of stronger signal. So there's kind of a lot to cover there, but this basically gives us a data set which is a representative and reliable overview of the activity of just our sample panel. Does that make? I'm going to pause for questions there because that was a lot to throw.
I'll comment one thing. I think this has been actually really helpful in the importance of this modeling that you guys applied to the data. I think it's maybe hard for users to really understand the challenges that come with working with the raw data sets that you're ingesting in order to create these. And your concept of like fraudulent data, I think maybe if you want to double down on what that might mean, it could be helpful as an example of why it's important for these models to exist to pull that data out. I really liked your example of how you guys can use your psychographic or demographic data to better infer visits. I think that's like a new concept to me that I haven't seen with other providers, or at least said out loud anywhere else. So I think that's a really it's a good testament to how much work goes into apply quality to these really challenging data sources.
Yeah, and I think, one thing to note here is that, for some companies, this is where the product ends. This is where the visits product ends. It is the visits observed by, what they're seeing from the sample panel. But yeah, there's a lot of volatility. We're seeing increasing evidence of fraudulent data within the location data itself. So any foot traffic, any visits provider that is relying solely on that data set, you can't really trust it. You can't fully trust that. There needs to be more to it. And I'll come to later on in the talk about how we actually do the validation and make sure the quality is high with this. But
one question before you. So sorry, I thought you were going to keep going. I just wanted to interrupt because there was one question that came in. How do you distinguish between employees and customers? Is there an ability for the models to do that?
Yeah, really great question. Really great question. So what we do with our sample panel of devices, and I'll explain this in more depth later, is we attribute a home location to them where we can. Now, what we're doing, it's difficult to do. It's more difficult to do that with a work location, but that's something that we do with a lot of the devices. And if we identify that, then we kind of remove them from the equation. The thing is that, the impact of that in the majority of stores is going to be so negligible that even when we don't catch it fully, it shouldn't have too much of an impact on the overall data. I'll take the sensor data as kind of like a counterpoint. They kind of face the same problem where they're tracking people going in and out of stores, but because it's just foot traffic in and out, they can't identify really whether it's employees or not. At the end of the day, the volumes that we're looking at are kind of so high that it is really negligible.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead and keep moving.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Right. So that's kind of the first step. Now we've got this initial sort of data set. We've made sense of the GPS data and we've attributed it, scored it, and weighted it, and linked it to points of interest. The next thing that we need to do is actually optimize the shape of the time series. So when I talk about shape here, what I'm talking about is the seasonality, visits on a Tuesday being different to visits on a Friday, visits at 11 o'clock in the morning are different to 5 o'clock in the evening. I'm talking about trend, I'm talking about the direction of the visits over time. And I'm also talking about the sort of residuals, the noise residuals that aren't, can't be explained by seasonal patterns and can't be explained by general sort of direction. The data set that we've got from the previous process is still noisy. It's still not, strong enough to send out to the public and say, this is the visits to the stores. So what we need to do now is to tease out the information, to tease out the features of this data that is important. So with all of the signals, with all of the sources that we access and that we utilize, we luckily have over 5 years worth of data on it. So that's a great historical sample to be playing around with. But we need to kind of work out, we kind of need to unbias this data from some of the biases that it's got inherent in it. So we use a forecasting framework called neural profit. Now, neural profit is a framework that evolved from something that Facebook created. Facebook profit, it was called, was a simple kind of Bayesian inference time series forecast. This was taken by some guys at Stanford University and evolved into neural profit. They took this inference model and they applied a neural network to it. Over the last year, 18 months, data scientists at Passby have been collaborating, have been working directly with these guys to add a more specific, a more particular aspect to our data to improve this. Basically, what we're doing with neural profit is trying to tease out those features, tease out the seasonality, tease out the noise residuals, so we know what are the most important parts, the most important inputs to throw into the model. And what the unique aspect that we've added to this model was basically a global local aspect. Now, what do I mean by that? So if there's an individual store, there are going to be things that are very specific to the way that store works. So that's the local aspect to it. But a store doesn't operate in isolation. It's going to be impacted by other things that are happening in the local area. So in the neighborhood, in the nearby location, it's going to be impacted by changes in the market. So looking at other sort of stores in the category, and it's going to be impacted by things that are happening on a chain level. So if a chain is having a sale or a promotion, those are all going to impact the foot traffic to this store. The global local aspect that we've added to neural profit looks to account for that. So, there's so much complexity in the data that we're playing with here, that we had to take what Facebook made, take what Stanford University then evolved, and then add our own bit onto it to make it work. So we've teased out all of the information from the GPS data. We also take information from weather, from things like retail holidays. A big part of our model applied to the model for 2020 was around business restrictions that came from COVID. So obviously a lot of categories of stores were completely closed based on the restrictions in that state, based on the restrictions in that city. We had to account for that. So we had to throw all that information in as well. And effectively, all of these inputs get thrown into our proprietary machine learning model to output just the shape, to optimize what we're seeing in our data, to optimize the shape to what is actually being seen on the ground. And this data is both calibrated, so we use signals from the sensor data in the model and validated against sensor data. And I've got some key metrics that I'll come back to in terms of just how that kind of works. But at each stage here, we're using that sensor data to calibrate and validate what the model is doing. So that's kind of that's optimizing the shape, that's optimizing the kind of the seasonality, direction, and residuals of the time series that we're providing. The next thing is to optimize the volume. We can have a perfect shape, but because we're only seeing a fraction of the sample of activity that's going on in the United States, the volumes are going to be too low or they're going to be off. So what we do here is we look at trade area data, we look at population data, and we look at the POI classification data as inputs to extrapolate what are the actual visits in. So we're looking at, okay, this individual store has a trade area this large, this trade area has a population density of this, and then we use that to inform what the actual visits are. In terms of the PI classification, a grocery store, a superstore is likely to have much more visits than a luxury jewelry store, for example. So all of these are components that are getting thrown into the model. And this model is used to basically extrapolate the volume and scale this up. Once again, we calibrate this, we input signals from the sensor data, and then we validate it against the sensor data at the end of it. So these last three models that I've kind of, or groups of models, if you will, that I've been sort of walking us through are all around the store visits. By the end of these processes, we get a really robust estimate of the store visits to over 1.5 million stores across the United States. The other side of that, the other data set that we provide is all around the visitor kind of attribution. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of how we get that data. We look over a macro kind of time period at the behavior of the devices. And from this, we see where they're most likely to spend their nights. The location that, we deem is most likely to, they're most likely to spend their nights, we infer that is their home location. We go, okay, well, if 90% of the time they're spending their evenings there, or if they're spending their sort of nighttime period there, then it's most likely going to be their home location. We then take this home location and connect it to a zip+4, because the zip+4s is where TransUnion's data is connected to. And from this, we're able to, from this connection bit in the middle here, we're able to attribute a probabilistic profile to our sample panel of devices. And this basically makes them a portable probabilistic profile that we then connect to the stores to give a sort of overview of those visitors then. Does that make any? I want to stop for questions there, because that hopefully that made sense, but I don't want to assume.
I do have one question that came in from probably a couple slides back, so I'll jump to that in a second. But while we're just on the topic of home visitor location and attributing to zip+4, I've seen researchers in the past use the inferred home location to do some sort of like joined against just like the census block group level, and then looking at the inferred demographics at the census block group level to imply, some sort of demographic of these visitors in certain, for other research that I've seen done. Walk me through just a little bit about like the differences in terms of your model, the granularity of census block versus zip+4, and your ability to model this across the data yourself versus putting it on the researchers might help that get just more granular into that detail.
Yeah, so I think can you hear me? Sorry, I think my earphones have just gone off.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay. So the process is functionally the same, insofar as we're taking an inferred home location, linking it to a location boundary that then has a data set attached to it. The difference between using census data or census block group data is that TransUnion's data updates every year. So we've got a higher sort of frequency to changes that happen in that neighborhood. And in addition to that, they provide much more information than just the census data itself. So obviously the information that is derived from the sensor is an input to what we're getting there. But because they can also draw information from financial sort of credit information, we get a broader data set, a more holistic data set, as well as a much more sort of frequently updated one. The final thing that TransUnion do is that they take these kind of disparate demographic sort of traits and information from the sort of financial and credit information that they've got, and they tie this into basically personas. And I've got an example of this a bit later on, but effectively they'll group this, they'll group the population of the states into these 56 psychographic sort of personas, which gives you a lot more, which gives a much more holistic overview of the people that are visiting there beyond the zeros and ones of the demographic traits themselves.
Nice. And then your question came in. It sounds like in the data, and you're going to get to the data sets, and we'll probably go into the kind of attributes made available probably at the last part of the presentation. So feel free to punt this, but it sounds like we're saying, are the zip plus fours actually made visible in the data sets, or just you're using that on your own, and then we're seeing the inferred psychographic information from your calculations?
Yeah, so you're seeing a little bit further down the road. This process is basically how we attribute these devices with this information. We then we then aggregate all of the devices that have visited a store and give a anonymized aggregated overview of the visitor profile, basically. So it's not looking at the individuals. Again, we're not looking at the individuals here, but it's going the group, the cohort that's visited this McDonald's look like this.
Yeah. Might be jumping a little bit back here, but there was a question that came in around, you mentioned this idea of like kind of low quality versus high quality data or visits. So what's an example of low quality visits? How do you deal with the fact that low quality visits may be correlated, or if this is true, are low quality visits correlated with certain users potentially?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, an ongoing sort of conversation we have with our suppliers is trying to sort of quality control what we get. So if we're seeing a lot of low quality signals appear in the data, then we kind of feed that back upstream so they can kind of identify it. It's part of the difficulty with the location data industry as a whole, that it's very sort of disparate. It's basically gotten to the point where it's a commodity, and some bad actors are pumping, some, low quality data into the market. So yeah, but in terms of how we deal with it functionally in our sort of models, if they're lower quality, then they have much less weight compared to the higher quality visits in the model. Great. Okay, cool. Right. So that is the models. I just wanted to kind of touch on the validation that we do, because I've kind of alluded to that throughout the presentation. Out of the kind of three sort of sections, the three kind of key models here, that being the shape, the volume, and the whole sort of profile attribution that we do. When we're looking at shape, when we're talking about shape, we're looking at correlation. Currently, our median daily correlation is 0.85 when you compare the output of our models with the sensor data. The weekly, the hourly correlation is similar. I think it's 0.82, 0.83. So a pretty high correlation there. In terms of volume, the way that we look at this is we rank the stores that we have in our database and the stores that we've got in the sensor data, and see how they compare. Now here, not quite as good. It's a 0.5 Kendall rank correlation. However, we've compared it against other providers in the market, and we're still outpacing by quite a significant element here. We're constantly trying to make improvements to this data, and perhaps we'll come back to that at the end. So this is one of the things that we're looking to improve over time. But it's important to note that this is still, powerful data that we're putting out on the market. And then the final thing is around profile attribution. So we've got a sample panel of 175 million devices. We've attributed, demographics, psychographics to these. How do we know that this is a representative panel? How do we know that this isn't skewed heavily to, young users of, like mobile apps, and it's throwing off the data? What we've done here is an analysis between the sample panel of devices that we've got and the overall population of the United States. And we looked at age, income, and race. And looking at the distributions of age, income, and race, the average error in sort of percentile points is 1.35. So it's really close in terms of those distributions, how similar the distributions were. The one place, I think the area where we were most clearly underrepresented was in the sort of higher income users in the sort of population. But even then, I think the percentile point error was about 4 percentile points. So again, really strong, really robust sort of numbers to rely on here. The final section of this talk is bringing it back down to the tangible. What are the data sets? What are the data sets that we're kind of providing here? So the first data set we'll talk about is store visits. This is a weekly, daily, and hourly count of visits to individual stores. With this information, we tie in, attributes around the point of interest itself, and each row effectively has a week's worth of data. The data is updated monthly, so at the end, I think it's the first Monday of each month, we provide the data for the previous month. And if you are using SafeGraph's data, we can link it up. The ID that we actually provide currently in the data set is not the same as SafeGraph's place key, but it does match. So Evan, perhaps we can talk about this later. If a lot of your users are using both, then we can connect them up. The second data set is store visitors. So here I've got a little bit of an overview of the psychographic profiles. So here's one called Old Money, and it just kind of gives an overview. But looking at the demographics, looking at the sort of lifestyle choices, looking at the kind of more psychological aspects of these persona groups to give a really holistic view of these people. We also provide demographics. At the moment, we're providing age, income, educational level, occupational industry, commute type, and home ownership. So are they an owner, a renter? Do they have a mortgage? Do they own it outright? The psychographics are those on the side there. The final thing that we provide is cross-shopping. So we look at the visitors who've gone to a McDonald's, and over the last 12 months, we indicate what percentage of those visited Old Navy or Rite Aid, and you can use this information to really segment these stores based on the visitors themselves. And that's one of the ways that we've seen businesses use this data. So I'm not going to go so far as to I'm not going to try and limit you in the applications of this data, because I think you guys are going to have a lot more creative applications than I am. But what I'm going to do is kind of indicate how other clients, how other sort of industries are using it. So I said at the beginning that we're kind of focused on retail, commercial real estate, so that the owners and developers of real estate properties, and the financial industry. When it comes to retail, the key use cases are around store operations, optimizing staff, optimizing stock, making sure they don't under or over account for either of those. We've seen companies use it for financial forecasting, to use this information to influence their models moving forward. We've seen them use it for site selection use cases, and for competitive benchmarking. What we found with retail is that these retailers are going to have a pretty good idea of what's going on within their own four walls, but knowing what's going on outside of those is a bit of a mystery. And with our data, we can kind of demystify that. When it comes to real estate, this is all around kind of making sure that they've got the best tenants for that location. So if they've got a vacant retail lot, how do they optimize and expedite prospecting so they're not wasting their time on people who wouldn't really work in that location? They can also use it within sort of negotiations. If a retailer is saying that their foot traffic, or they're not seeing as many sales as they've seen previously, then the mall owner, for example, can rebut and say, well, actually, we're seeing foot traffic increase over time, not just to the mall as a whole, but to your location. And those are some of the kind of ways that the commercial real estate industry can use the data. Finally, the financial industry is something that we've just sort of moved into in the last year. Hedge funds and other sort of investment firms are using this data to try and correlate it against the retail investment choices that they're doing. So how well does it correlate against sales and year-on-year sales? Can we put this into our sort of quant strategy to get that edge, get that alpha? So those are kind of the use cases. There's obviously obviously loads more, but hopefully that sort of serves as inspiration. The final thing, just to kind of finish off, I've talked a little bit about the metrics that we use to validate the accuracy of our data. I wanted to kind of contextualize that a little bit in the last couple of slides. So what we did last year is an independent analysis working with a client that had access to multiple different data sources, our data source, and some of the other competitors on the market. And we compared how well we stacked up when we were comparing it against the sensor data. So the orange line is the best competitor that we could find. Green is the ground truth data as provided by the sensor traffic, and blue is pass-bys. And you can kind of see our data by far and away is the closest to what is actually happening on the ground. And to display that another way, you can see on the top row here, this is the ground truth value. The difference for the competitor is consistently and at some points significantly further away from the truth than our data. So that's everything that I kind of wanted to talk about today. Any other questions, anything anyone wants to get off their chest?
Awesome. Well, thank you, Matt. That was awesome and very insightful and very helpful for me. And I know some of the audience as well. I do have a lot of questions that have come through now. I'm going to try to get through these as quickly as possible. Now that we've kind of summarized everything, I think it makes sense to touch back on a few of them. So a couple questions around, I'll try to roll some together, kind of just like the differences between this data set and others, either other foot traffic providers transparently that are available on Dewey or elsewhere. And I think obviously now that you've talked through kind of the three phases of the sourcing and then the modeling and then the outputs and the actual attributes, I think like it's clear where each element of those can be different. But if you had to kind of summarize at a high level how this is like truly different from some of the other vendors out there, what would be like kind of the takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we realized quite early on in the journey here that relying solely on the location data was not going to get us anywhere near the truth. So we've had a whole sort of journey, a whole evolution of this data set to get us to where we are now. And the real thing here is just using one AI. I mean, machine learning, the models that we've got in the that we're using are absolutely key and crucial to what we're doing here. But also feeding those sort of models, feeding the AI with as much data, with as much sort of signals as possible. And I think, crucially for us, having that ground truth data set with the sensor data to both calibrate what we're doing and validate it, that's really the game changer.
And one question about the just historical coverage of the data set. And there's a couple questions about the coverage and attributes. And I'll just say quickly before you answer, this is available in the platform for subscribers, but even if you're just a user who's created a Dewey account, you can see the schema and things like the historical coverage and all the different attributes and the descriptions of each attribute in the platform. So I definitely encourage folks to go and download a sample and check it out for themselves. But talk a little bit about the just historical coverage. How you guys think about that? I know you talked about updating it on a monthly basis, but then you kind of re-roll out some backfills a little bit more occasionally as well. So I think it'd be nice to cover that.
Yeah. Great question. So I mean, we're constantly making updates to the models. And one of the kind of challenges we've set ourselves for this year is to kind of reduce the latency. So instead of providing updates on a monthly basis, getting that much closer to like a day behind. So yeah, we've got the I think that's one of the things that we're really trying to sort of improve. I think at the moment the way that we've set things up on Dewey data is that we'll have an updated data set with a new model every quarter. But yeah, that's the big challenge for the first half of this year.
Yeah. And it'll be about 2 years of history. And that's kind of like a rolling 2 years that you are going to provide, or is there any idea of like in the future, maybe that historical coverage expanding over time?
Oh, right. Yeah, I think we provide, or we can provide 5 years. So if we are doing 2 years, then we
Okay,
can certainly increase that.
cool. That's great. And then can we match brands to firm identifiers, like a ticker or something like that? I know you mentioned the potential join key between that and like a place key or something from Safegraph, which I know has its own join keys, but how do you think about matching brands to other identifiers?
Yeah, so currently in the data set that we provide, there is a the name connects to the name of the chain. So that should be consistent. But we can do kind of two things. We can add a specific identifier to match those up. And what we certainly do with the financial sort of industry is we provide ticker information. So if that's something that's useful, we can do that where applicable. So yeah, that's definitely something that we can improve.
Cool. One question, it's pretty specific, but does Passby have any plans to add hospital POIs in the future? And I'll join this to a question that I typically ask of what are Passby's plans for the future? Where do you guys go from here?
Yeah, really great question. So we're squarely sort of focused on kind of those three industries at the moment: retail, real estate, and the financial sort of industry. In terms of the focus, in terms of points of interest, we're really looking at sort of consumer focused and consumer facing sort of stores, places where people are spending money, either recreationally or sort of in a consumer way. So do we provide data on hospitals? Now, we've actually got within our data set a list of sensitive categories that we don't provide analysis on. At the end of the day, while it's an increasingly small part of what we're doing, the location data still does potentially hold sensitive location on devices. So anything that's linked to sort of healthcare locations, anything that's linked to sort of political sort of locations, we've got a blanket ban at the moment, so that does not appear in the data. Now, on a sort of case by case basis, we look at kind of the nature of who's asking for this data, what their use case is, and we can kind of do it in a custom way. But our real focus here is safeguarding the privacy of our sample panel. So no, hospitals is not something we're looking at in our roadmap. What we're probably going to move to next is expanding across the rest of North America. Now, that's not going to be in the next 6 months, but I think by the end of the year, we'll start to look towards Canada and then perhaps down towards Mexico as well.
Perfect. Three more quick ones here. Thanks for the talk. Super interesting. I'm curious about the shape models. How do your models account for conditions that aren't directly inputted into your model? For example, would a model treat a day with unusually low visitation would it smooth it out, or would you see that noise in the data?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really great question. That's a really great question. So yeah, the way that we kind of tackle that in terms of a spike of visits is we try to put in as many sort of inputs as regressors as possible. So identifying that there's going to be a spike of visits in the Super Bowl, for example, or identifying that there's going to be a spike of visits, during sort of Black Friday. Quite frankly, yes, if there was a drop of visits that was unseasonally or not kind of represented by trend, that might sort of slip past and that might get smoothed out. But again, the challenge that we've set ourselves of improving the latency should kind of look to improve that. So if the signals that we're seeing from some of the dynamic sources that we're getting in terms of location data, in terms of census data, is showing a sort of a trough of visits or some sort of drop in visits, then by the middle of this year, hopefully that will be more represented in the data.
Sounds good. And then Can you maybe touch back quickly? And I know we talked about this a bit, so there's a bunch of stuff you already covered, but just with regards to the sensor data, it seems like there's a lot of weight on the sensor data to kind of improve the models and the data that you're reporting. Are these sensors potentially double counting people? Can you explain a little bit more about like how you infer the quality from this data? It seems like you use that as a reference for quality a lot in terms of the sensor data. So how is that like a better signal quality than maybe mobility by itself?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I mean, at the end of the day, what by being physically inside of the location itself and tracking, people walking past the door through hardware, that is inevitably going to be better because they're seeing more of the picture than the GPS data provides. Now, that's not to say it's infallible. That's not to say it's a perfect data set by any means, but in terms of the available beyond perhaps a literal human, like counting the specific people that are going in and out, um, that is probably the best that we're going to get. Now, there is obviously a lot of companies that are working around computer imagery and sort of using the visuals to kind of do this as well. We've tried that in the past. We have seen a company that we kind of looked at in relation there, but the thing that they didn't have was the scale. And that sort of technology is still quite new in the grand scheme of things. So in terms of what is available in the market, that is the highest quality ground truth that we were able to access.
Sounds good. Last question, and then we can follow up with any others that come after this. But um, good question here. I've seen this asked across multiple data sets, but do you have any sort of like documentation about kind of what we just covered, how the data is collected, how it's modeled that I can refer to if we are going to publish research using this data?
Yeah, so that's something that we're in the process of kind of finalizing just to make sure it's as clear as possible. But yeah, I can definitely kind of share that with you guys, and then you can share that with the rest of your users.
Perfect. Yeah, if we have that, we'll definitely add it to the listing so it's right next to the data sets made
Great.
available on Dewey. Well, awesome, Matt. We'll call it there. Thank you so much for your time. Super insightful stuff. And like I said to all the attendees, we'll be sending out the recording in the next day or two. So be on the lookout for that. And if any questions come through, you can actually respond directly to that follow-up email. It'll go to me, and then I can pull Matt in if we have any additional questions that need to be answered. But Matt, thank you for your time. That was really great. Appreciate it.
Evan, thanks so much. This was great. Cheers.
All right. Take care. See you guys.